Before it was a battlefield, Gettysburg was a town of roads. It sat in Adams County in south-central Pennsylvania, surrounded by farms, ridges, fields, orchards, and lanes that carried ordinary traffic through an ordinary place. Wagons came and went. People moved between market towns. Roads reached toward Chambersburg, toward York, toward Baltimore, toward Emmitsburg, toward Taneytown, toward Carlisle, and toward the smaller crossings and communities of the region. By the summer of 1863, this road pattern mattered in a way no one in Gettysburg had asked for. The American Battlefield Trust notes that 10 roads led into Gettysburg. That simple fact helps explain why two great armies, moving across Pennsylvania in uncertainty, could be pulled toward the same town. Gettysburg was not chosen in advance as the place where the largest battle of the Civil War would unfold. It was not the intended stage for a decisive confrontation between General Robert E. Lee and Major General George G. Meade. It was a road hub, and in war, road hubs have gravity. Armies in the Civil War did not move as one solid mass. They moved in columns, by corps, divisions, brigades, artillery trains, cavalry, wagons, and supply vehicles. They needed roads. They needed crossings. They needed towns where routes met and information could be gathered. A commander might have a broad objective, but a campaign often unfolded through the limits of geography. Which road was open, which pass was guarded, where food could be found, where the enemy had last been seen. Gettysburg offered roads from multiple directions. That made it useful. It also made it dangerous. By late June of 1863, Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had moved into Pennsylvania. The campaign had begun earlier that month, after Lee's victory at Chancellorsville, and its purpose was larger than any single town. Lee wanted to shift pressure away from war-worn Virginia. He wanted to carry the conflict onto northern soil. He wanted to threaten territory that had not felt the war in the same direct way that Virginia had. As his army moved north, Confederate forces concentrated in the region near Chambersburg, about 22 miles west of Gettysburg. The Union Army of the Potomac, now under Major General George G. Meade, turned in response. Meade had only recently taken command, and he faced the urgent task of finding and confronting Lee without allowing Washington, Baltimore, or the northern interior to be exposed. But neither Meade nor Lee had planned for a major battle to begin at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. The armies were searching, screening, marching, and reacting. They were not yet positioned for the formal battle that memory would later make seem inevitable. Nothing about Gettysburg made the collision inevitable in a grand strategic sense. But everything about Gettysburg made collision possible. To the west of town lay McPherson Ridge, open ground and rising land that would become the first major scene of combat. Beyond and behind that area stood Seminary Ridge, associated with the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and later with Confederate positions during much of the battle. East and south of town, the land rose again toward Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, high ground that would become the backbone of the Union defensive line. Farther out, the landscape included Culp's Hill, Little Round Top, the boulder-strewn ground of Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard. These names would become fixed in American memory, but on the morning the battle began, they were still pieces of a local landscape. The terrain did not look like a fortress. It was not a single mountain wall or a prepared military line. It was a pattern of ridges, slopes, fields, roads, stone walls, and farm properties. Its importance emerged only when armies entered it. Once soldiers began to fight there, every rise and depression gained meaning. A ridge became a shield. A road became a route of reinforcement or retreat. A hill became an anchor for an army's flank. A town street became a passageway under fire. The first collision came west of Gettysburg near McPherson Ridge, where Confederate forces attacked Union troops on July 1st. What began as contact between parts of two armies grew quickly. More troops arrived. The road network that had drawn the armies toward Gettysburg now fed the battle itself. Columns could march toward the sound of guns from different directions. Commanders had to make decisions before the full picture was clear. Local geography became operational reality. This is one of the quiet truths of Gettysburg. The battle began before either commander fully controlled its shape. Lee was not standing over a finished map, choosing Gettysburg as his desired battlefield. Meade had not arranged his army in advance to fight precisely there. Yet once contact occurred, both armies had to respond. A fight west of town could not simply be ignored. Roads, corps movements, and enemy pressure turned an encounter into a battle. By the end of the first day, the Union defenders would be driven back through Gettysburg, but that retreat would not mean the collapse of the Federal Army. It would place Union troops on high ground around Cemetery Hill. That high ground changed everything. Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge formed a defensive position that helped define the next 2 days. The Union line would bend through the landscape in a way that allowed Meade's army to hold interior positions. The Confederates, occupying ground that included Seminary Ridge, would have to attack across fields, slopes, and exposed approaches. The distance between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge would become one of the most consequential spaces in American military history. On July 3rd, Confederate troops would cross roughly 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the Union Center in the assault remembered as Pickett's Charge. But the importance of that ground began earlier, when the armies found themselves facing each other across the low ridges around Gettysburg. The town itself suffered the transformation first. Gettysburg's roads had once connected civilians to the surrounding region. Now those same roads brought armed men, artillery, ambulances, couriers, and confusion. The battle would overlap with civilian space, farms, homes, streets, fields, and burial grounds. The war that had moved into Pennsylvania was no longer an abstraction. It was passing through doorways and across gardens. It was taking possession of roads that had never been built for armies of this size. And Gettysburg was not only a white civilian town caught in military movement. The Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania created immediate danger for African American residents in Gettysburg and the surrounding region, who fled because they feared capture and enslavement. The arrival of Lee's army on northern soil carried with it the violence of slavery's reach. Military geography and human vulnerability met in the same place. The roads that pulled armies inward also became roads of flight. This is why Gettysburg must be understood first as a place, not only as an event. Its roads explain the convergence. Its ridges explain the battle's form. Its town streets explain the human cost of fighting through a civilian community. Its location in Pennsylvania explains the shock of Lee's campaign northward. And its high ground explains why a battle that neither Lee nor Meade had selected became a contest that neither could easily abandon. Over 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia fought in and around this town. The result would halt Lee's second invasion of the North. The losses would be enormous, reaching roughly 51,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Later, Gettysburg would become a preserved battlefield, the national cemetery, and a place where Abraham Lincoln would give language to the meaning of the war. But before the cemetery, before the address, before the monuments and the maps, there was the road hub. A Pennsylvania town stood where 10 roads met. To the west, Confederate forces were moving through a campaign that had begun in Virginia and carried them toward Chambersburg. To the south and east, the Union Army of the Potomac was turning to meet the danger. Between them lay Gettysburg, not planned as the battlefield, not prepared for the burden, but positioned at the crossing of movement, terrain, and chance. The roads brought the armies close. The ridges held them there. And the campaign that had begun with Lee's decision to move north was about to tighten around a small town in Adams County. The roads around Gettysburg mattered because armies were already in motion before the town became famous. The ridges did not choose the battle. The crossroads did not command it. They only waited while larger decisions, made days and miles away, began to draw armed men northward. That movement began on June 3rd, 1863. Robert E. Lee had just come through Chancellorsville, a Confederate victory in Virginia that strengthened his confidence and left the Army of Northern Virginia still capable of offensive action. Virginia had carried a heavy burden through the war. Armies had marched there, fought there, consumed food there, trampled fields there, and forced civilians to live near the constant pressure of military operations. Lee's decision to move north was not simply a search for battle. It was a strategic attempt to shift that pressure away from Virginia, to move the war onto northern soil, and to make the United States respond to a Confederate army operating in Pennsylvania. The movement was bold because it changed the geography of danger. For much of the war, the Confederate capital and the Virginia countryside had stood near the center of military attention in the Eastern Theater. By carrying the Army of Northern Virginia northward, Lee threatened a Union state. He widened the anxiety of the campaign. A Confederate force in Pennsylvania could not be treated as a distant problem. It meant roads, farms, towns, rail connections, and political communities in the North now lay within reach of invasion. In early June, the Army of Northern Virginia began leaving its positions in Virginia. The columns did not move as a single mass across one road. Civil War armies were too large for that. They moved through networks of roads, by corps and divisions, with wagons, artillery, horses, ammunition, medical supplies, and all the slow machinery of an army in the field. Their progress was not a clean line on a map. It was a rolling system of men and material, spread across miles, depending on roads, weather, discipline, and information. Lee's purpose was not to rush blindly toward Gettysburg. At this stage, Gettysburg was not the destination for a planned great battle. The campaign had a broader shape. The Confederate Army was moving from Virginia into Pennsylvania, seeking room, supplies, and strategic advantage. It was moving in a way that forced the Union Army of the Potomac to react. If Lee could draw federal attention away from Virginia, threaten Northern territory, and concentrate his own army where it could operate effectively, he might alter the military and political pressure of the war. This is why the movement north mattered before a shot was fired at Gettysburg. Campaigns are decided not only by what happens on the battlefield, but by the pressures that bring armies there. Lee's army was not wandering. It was carrying a strategic argument into enemy territory, that the Confederacy could still strike beyond its own borders, that the war could be made costly and frightening for the North, and that Virginia might be relieved, at least temporarily, from the constant presence of opposing armies. As the Confederate columns moved north, Pennsylvania became more than a name on a map. It became the ground beneath the campaign. The invasion brought immediate danger to communities that had not expected to become the path of a major army. For African American residents of Gettysburg and the surrounding region, the threat was especially direct. The Confederate movement into Pennsylvania created fear of capture and enslavement. Free black residents in the region understood that military invasion could carry with it the danger of kidnapping, forced removal, and the destruction of freedom that had been lived day by day in a Union state. The campaign was therefore not only an operation between armies, it moved through civilian lives. The northward movement also created uncertainty. In an age before instant communication, commanders worked through reports, scouts, cavalry screens, and fragments of intelligence. Distance mattered. Roads mattered. The location of enemy corps mattered. An army could be near enough to threaten and still unclear enough to conceal its exact purpose. Lee wanted freedom of movement. The Union command needed to determine where he was going, how far north he intended to move, and where he could be brought to battle under favorable conditions. By late June, the Confederate Army had entered Pennsylvania and was drawing toward a concentration near Chambersburg. Chambersburg stood roughly 22 miles west of Gettysburg, and in this campaign, it became a major point around which Confederate forces gathered. Its location mattered. West of Gettysburg, connected by road to the larger region, Chambersburg offered a place for Lee's army to concentrate after its movement through the Shenandoah Valley and into Pennsylvania. It was close enough to threaten deeper movement in the state, and close enough to the web of roads that would later pull Confederate and Union units toward Gettysburg. At Chambersburg, the campaign took on a more dangerous stillness. An army that has been marching begins to become a question. Where will it strike, and where will the enemy try to stop it? Lee had succeeded in bringing the war north. He had shifted the theater of anxiety. But success in movement created another problem. His army, spread across roads and operating in enemy territory, needed concentration. The farther an army moved, the more important it became to gather its parts before a major fight. Scattered forces could seize supplies and cover ground, but they could also become vulnerable if the enemy appeared in strength. Chambersburg, therefore, was not simply a town west of Gettysburg. It was part of the campaign's mechanism. The Confederate Army's movement toward that area placed Lee's forces within reach of the road network that connected the Pennsylvania countryside. From there, the Army could threaten, maneuver, and respond. Yet it also meant that the shape of the campaign began to narrow. Roads that had opened possibilities now began to channel movement. Reports of enemy activity, the need to concentrate, and the presence of Union forces moving in response would soon tighten the space between the armies. The irony is that Lee's northern movement was strategic, but the battle it produced would begin by convergence rather than by design. He had set out to relieve pressure on Virginia and carry threat into the north. He had not set out to make Gettysburg the central battlefield of the campaign. The same was true on the other side. The Union Army did not select Gettysburg in advance as the chosen place where the invasion must be decided. The town's importance emerged because movement, roads, and terrain intersected there at the wrong moment for peace and the right moment for war. From the Confederate point of view, the movement into Pennsylvania carried hope and risk together. Hope because it showed that the Army of Northern Virginia remained aggressive after Chancellorsville. Hope because it might unsettle Northern confidence and force the United States to defend its own territory. Hope because it could shift the burden away from exhausted Virginia ground. But risk because every mile north carried Lee farther from familiar country and deeper into a region where the Union Army of the Potomac could move to cut, block, or strike. The campaign also placed Lee's army inside a landscape of farms, ridges, towns, and roads that had not been built for military destiny. The roads that served everyday life now became routes for infantry and artillery. Towns that had measured distance in trade and local travel now measured it in marching columns. Chambersburg, about 22 miles west of Gettysburg, became part of a chain of movement that would soon link Virginia's battle-worn fields to the low Pennsylvania ridges where the 3 days would unfold. By the end of June, Lee had achieved the first great fact of the campaign. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was in Pennsylvania. The war had crossed into Northern territory in force. The pressure had shifted. The danger had moved. But the very success of that movement demanded a federal answer. South and east of the Confederate concentration, the Union Army of the Potomac was turning toward the threat. Its commanders had to interpret Lee's movement, protect northern ground, and find a way to meet an army that had already seized the initiative. The roads around Gettysburg still lay quiet compared with what was coming. But the space between Chambersburg and the small town in Adams County was shrinking in military importance. Lee had moved north to change the war's pressure. Now the Army of the Potomac had to turn, march, and find him. Lee's movement north had changed the shape of the war for everyone behind him. It had pulled the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia out of the familiar killing ground of Virginia and into Pennsylvania, a Union state where farms, towns, roads, and rail lines now felt the nearness of invasion. But an army moving north did not simply create opportunity. It also created danger. Every mile Lee gained deepened the need for the United States to answer. That answer would come from the Army of the Potomac. By the time Gettysburg entered the story, the Union Army was already moving through a campaign of its certainty. Its task was clear in the broadest sense and difficult in every practical one. It had to shield Northern territory. It had to keep itself between Lee's army and the vital cities and routes behind it. It had to locate the Confederate columns, understand their purpose, and bring them to battle under conditions that did not favor Lee. And it had to do all this while the enemy had already seized the initiative. At its head stood Major General George G. Meade. Meade would become inseparable from Gettysburg, but he did not choose Gettysburg as a battlefield. He did not begin the campaign with a fixed plan to fight a 3-day battle in the fields and ridges around a small town in Adams County. Like Lee, he was operating inside a moving crisis. The shape of the battle was not yet visible. There was no single point on the map where both commanders had agreed to test the fate of the campaign. There were only columns, roads, reports, distances, and decisions made under pressure. This is one of the quiet truths of Gettysburg. The battle that later came to seem inevitable was not inevitable to the men marching toward it. It emerged from movement. The Army of the Potomac was a large force, identified in summaries of the battle at about 94,000 men. It was the principal Union field army in the Eastern Theater, and in the summer of 1863, it carried a burden that was larger than its numbers. Lee's second invasion of the North had brought the Confederate Army onto Union soil. The Army of the Potomac had to stop it. If Lee could move freely through Pennsylvania, he might continue to shift pressure away from Virginia, threaten Northern territory, and alter the political and military atmosphere of the war. If Meade could bring him under control, the invasion might be halted before it achieved its larger purpose. But stopping Lee required more than bravery. It required knowing where the Confederate Army was, where it was going, and how to position the Union Army against it. The Confederate concentration near Chambersburg mattered because it gave Meade and the Union command a broad direction of danger. Chambersburg lay about 22 miles west of Gettysburg. Lee's army had moved into that region in force. Yet knowing the general area of an enemy army is not the same as knowing where the decisive fight will occur. Armies in the Civil War did not move as a single compact body down one road. They spread over routes. They used turnpikes, lanes, and crossroads. They carried artillery, wagons, ammunition, rations, and wounded men. They advanced in parts, each part dependent on information that could arrive late, imperfect, or not at all. In that environment, Gettysburg's roads began to matter in a new way. The town was not yet the intended battlefield, but it sat within the zone of convergence bed. Roads reached into it from multiple directions, and earlier in the story, those roads were just geography, the ordinary network of a south-central Pennsylvania town. Now, under the pressure of campaign movement, they became military channels. Units looking for contact, supplies, positions, or routes of march could be drawn toward the same road hub without either army having planned a grand collision there. For Meade, the problem was not simply to chase Lee. A reckless pursuit could expose the Union Army to defeat. A slow response could surrender the initiative entirely. The Army of the Potomac had to turn with purpose, but it also had to preserve itself as a fighting force. Its strength mattered because this was the army that could stand between the Confederate invasion and deeper Northern consequences. The Union soldiers marching north were not just following an enemy. They were carrying the Federal response to a campaign designed to unsettle the North. This is why the command pressure on Meade was so severe. He faced an opponent who had recently won at Chancellorsville and who had now carried the war into Pennsylvania. Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, was experienced, dangerous, and confident enough to operate far from its original base of movement. To defeat it, Meade had to make decisions before the battlefield had fully revealed itself. He had to read the campaign while it was still unfolding. The civilians of Pennsylvania felt that uncertainty as well. The invasion was not an abstraction for the people in its path. Gettysburg and the surrounding region included free black residents who faced a particular danger as Confederate forces moved through Pennsylvania, the fear of capture and enslavement. For them, the arrival of the Confederate Army was not only a military event. It was a threat to freedom and family, immediate and personal. The larger armies moved across maps, but the people in those towns and farms lived inside the consequences. That human pressure formed part of the atmosphere through which the Army of the Potomac marched to the fleet. The Union Army was not approaching an empty landscape. It was entering a region of homes, roads, fields, and communities already disturbed by invasion. The war had come north, and the Federal Army's turn toward Lee was also a turn toward protecting the ground beneath its own flag. Still, the final point of contact remained uncertain. Gettysburg was only one town among many in the path of campaign movement. Its ridges had not yet become famous positions. Cemetery Hill had not yet become the place where a battered Union line would reform. Cemetery Ridge had not yet become the long defensive spine that Lee would test on the third day. Seminary Ridge had not yet become the Confederate-held line remembered in maps and memory. McPherson Ridge, west of town, was still ground waiting for events. What brought the armies closer was the logic of roads and response. Lee's army had pushed north and concentrated west of Gettysburg. Meade's army had turned toward the danger from the south and east. Between them lay a web of routes, and Gettysburg sat where those routes met. Neither commander needed to select the town deliberately for it to become important. It was enough that both armies were moving, that both needed roads, and that neither could fully control the timing of contact. By the end of June, the campaign had entered a dangerous middle space. Lee had not yet been stopped. Meade had not yet found the battle he would be forced to fight. The Army of the Potomac was still maneuvering toward the Confederate threat, trying to protect northern ground while avoiding a disastrous mistake. The Army of Northern Virginia was still operating inside Pennsylvania, its presence forcing every Union decision to carry urgency. In that space, chance and geography began to narrow the choices of generals. The name Gettysburg had not yet become a synonym for sacrifice. It was still a town of roads in Adams County, surrounded by ridges and fields. But the movement of two armies was bending toward it. From the west came the Confederate presence around Chambersburg. From the south and east came the Federal response under George G. Meade. Every march reduced the distance. Every road offered another way in. Every report, delay, and decision pushed armed men closer to the same ground. And on the morning of July 1st, 1863, west of Gettysburg, near McPherson Ridge, the uncertainty of the campaign would harden into contact. The movement that had been building across Pennsylvania did not become a battle all at once. It became a battle by contact, by pressure, by men arriving on roads that had seemed only days before like lines on a campaign map. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, that contact came west of Gettysburg, near McPherson Ridge. The place mattered before anyone knew how much it would matter. McPherson Ridge lay outside the town, and the open country where roads, fields, fences, and farm ground shaped the way soldiers could move and fight. It was not the great final line of the battle. It was not Cemetery Ridge, where the Union center would later stand. It was not Cemetery Hill, the high ground that would become so important by the end of the day. But on that morning, west of Gettysburg, McPherson Ridge became the first hard edge of the campaign. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had been moving through Pennsylvania after Robert E. Idea, Lee's decision to carry the war north. Its presence around Chambersburg, about 22 miles west of Gettysburg, had already changed the strategic map. The Union Army of the Potomac, now under Major General George G. Meade, had turned to meet that threat. Neither commander had selected Gettysburg as the intended field for a major battle. Neither army had marched toward the town with a settled plan to fight the defining engagement of the campaign there. Yet armies do not need intention to create battle. They need proximity. They need roads. They need reports that are incomplete, orders that arrive under pressure, and forward troops who suddenly find the enemy close enough to fire upon. That is what happened west of Gettysburg. Confederate forces attacked Union troops near McPherson Ridge, and the uncertainty of the campaign became immediate violence. The first exchanges were more than a local collision. They revealed that both armies were closer than their commanders could comfortably control. What had been a campaign of movement now began to take on the shape of a battlefield. For the men on the ground, the larger strategy was not abstract, but it was distant. They did not experience the moment as a grand turning point. They experienced it as smoke, sound, urgency, and the need to hold a position long enough for support to arrive. They stood in the western approaches to a Pennsylvania town that had become important because so many roads led toward it. The very road network that had drawn armies toward Gettysburg now made reinforcement possible and made withdrawal dangerous. The Confederate attack near McPherson Ridge tested the Union presence west of town. It also tested the meaning of Gettysburg's terrain. The ridges around the town were not mountains, but they mattered. Low ground and rising ground could decide how far men could see, how artillery might be placed, where infantry could form, and how a retreat might unfold. West of town, the struggle began along the approaches that led toward Gettysburg itself. Behind the Union defenders lay the town streets. Beyond those streets, rising ground waited, Cemetery Hill, and farther south, the ridgeline that would become the backbone of the Federal defensive position. But none of that was certain in the morning. At first, the fight near McPherson Ridge belonged to the first day alone. It was a clash at the edge of a town, a meeting of advanced forces, an engagement neither side had designed as the opening of a 3-day battle. Yet the structure of the campaign made it dangerous. Lee's army was on northern soil. Meade's army was moving to confront him. Gettysburg stood at a road hub in Adams County, where movement from different directions could converge rapidly. Once contact occurred, more men could be drawn in. Once more men were drawn in, commanders faced the risk of feeding a fight they had not chosen, because disengaging could be just as hazardous as continuing. This is one reason the first day at Gettysburg is so important. It was not simply a prelude. It began the process by which a meeting engagement became a major battle. A meeting engagement is shaped by uncertainty. Commanders must make decisions while the size, position, and intention of the enemy are still becoming clear. A small fight can remain small if one side breaks contact, or if the ground is not worth holding. But at Gettysburg, the circumstances encouraged escalation. The town's roads offered routes of arrival. The surrounding ridges offered positions that seemed worth defending. The armies themselves were large enough that any serious collision could gather weight quickly. Confederate pressure west of Gettysburg forced the Union defenders to contest ground they could not easily abandon without consequence. If the Confederates pushed through the western approaches, the fighting could roll directly into town. If Union troops gave way too soon, the Confederate army might seize the roads and the high ground beyond. But if Union troops held too long, they risked being overwhelmed as Confederate strength increased. The battle therefore began with a problem that would echo through the entire first day. How long could the Federal defenders hold west and north of Gettysburg, and where could they fall back if the line broke? McPherson Ridge became one answer, but only temporarily. The ridge gave Union troops a place to resist the initial Confederate attack. It delayed the Confederate advance and forced the fight to develop outside the town rather than immediately inside it. Time mattered. In a battle born from convergence, time could allow more troops to arrive, commanders to understand the danger, and a defensive plan to take shape. But time came at a cost. Every hour of resistance west of Gettysburg exposed men to mounting pressure. The Confederate attack did not remain an isolated push. As the fighting grew, the broader reality became clearer. This was no longer merely a search for supplies, a patrol, or a passing encounter on a road. The armies were finding each other. The campaign had reached the point where movement could no longer be separated from combat. There is a quiet tragedy in that kind of beginning. Gettysburg did not ask to become the place. Its fields, ridges, and roads were ordinary parts of civilian life. The roads connected farms and towns. The land held fences, lanes, and open ground. But war turns ordinary geography into military necessity. A ridge becomes a defensive line. A road becomes an avenue of attack. A town becomes an obstacle, a refuge, or a trap. By midday on July 1st, the consequences of first contact were expanding. The Confederate forces attacking west of Gettysburg had committed the Army of Northern Virginia to a growing fight. The Union troops defending near McPherson Ridge had tied the Army of the Potomac to the same ground. Neither Lee nor Meade had planned Gettysburg as the decisive battlefield, but both armies were now being pulled into it by the momentum of combat. This was how the first day began, to define the next two. If the Union army had been destroyed west of town, there might have been no strong Federal position to hold around Gettysburg. If the Confederate army had failed to press the advantage, the opportunity created by contact might have passed. Instead, the fighting continued to widen. It moved across the western approaches and placed increasing strain on the Union defenders. McPherson Ridge, important in the morning, became part of a larger struggle for the ground west and north of the town. What began near a ridge now threatened to spill into Gettysburg itself. The Union position west of town could not remain secure forever under growing pressure. The defenders had bought time, but the Confederate attacks were forcing the issue. Behind them lay Gettysburg's streets. Beyond those streets lay Cemetery Hill, not yet fully understood as the anchor it would become, but already part of the terrain that could decide whether defeat on the first field became disaster, or whether it became withdrawal to stronger ground. The first contact at McPherson Ridge had done more than open the battle. It had set the direction of the day. The fight neither side had planned was now expanding beyond the ridge, toward the town, toward the roads, and toward the high ground that waited on the other side. The fight that had opened west of Gettysburg did not stay west of Gettysburg. By the afternoon of July 1st, 1863, the fields near McPherson Ridge were no longer an isolated point of contact. They were part of a widening battle, one that had drawn in more men, more roads, and more consequences than either army had intended when the day began. The Union defenders had stood long enough to slow the Confederate advance, but standing was not the same as holding forever. Pressure from the west and north began to bend the Federal line back toward the town. Gettysburg, until that morning, had been a road hub in Adams County. Its importance had come from geography: 10 roads leading in, farms and ridges around it, and a location that made it hard for moving armies to ignore. But now the town itself became part of the battlefield. The roads that had pulled soldiers toward Gettysburg became routes of retreat, pursuit, confusion, and survival. For the Union soldiers falling back, the movement through town was not an orderly parade to better ground. It was the visible sign of defeat on the first day's outer fields. The positions west of Gettysburg and north of Gettysburg had been overcome. Confederate forces had attacked, Federal defenders had resisted, and by the time the line gave way, the withdrawal carried men into streets meant for wagons, market traffic, churchgoers, and local life. This is one of the reasons Gettysburg is remembered not only as a battle of ridges and fields, but as a battle where civilian geography and military action overlapped. The town was not separate from the fighting. It was pulled into the movement of armies because it sat at the center of the roads. Its streets became the passage between the first day's defeat and the ground that might still be saved. The retreat through Gettysburg mattered because it did not end in complete collapse. That distinction is easy to lose when the first day is described simply as a Confederate success. On the ground west and north of town, the Union Army had been driven back. But the result of a battlefield defeat depends on where the defeated army goes, whether it can reform, and whether the terrain ahead gives it another chance. Beyond the town rose Cemetery Hill. At the beginning of the day, Cemetery Hill was not yet the name that would define the Union position at Gettysburg. It was part of the landscape south of town, one of the high places in a region shaped by low ridges and connecting roads. But as Federal troops were pushed back through Gettysburg, its meaning changed. It became not just ground, but refuge. Not just elevation, but structure. It offered the possibility that a broken line could become a defensive line. The contrast was severe. Behind the Union soldiers lay the fields where the morning fight had grown into a major battle. Around them were the streets of Gettysburg, crowded now by the motion of retreat and pursuit. Ahead lay high ground that could still be held. The movement from McPherson Ridge through town toward Cemetery Hill became the hinge of the first day. If the retreat had dissolved entirely in the streets, the story of Gettysburg might have turned in a different direction. The Confederate Army had gained momentum. The Union forces had lost ground. The town itself had fallen into the path of the advance. But because Federal troops moved toward Cemetery Hill, the defeat west and north of town did not become the end of Union resistance at Gettysburg. It became the beginning of a new position. This was the central consequence of the first day. The Union Army had been beaten back, but not driven away from the battlefield. It had lost the first fields of combat, but it still held a commanding place. In war, that difference can decide everything. A retreat to poor ground invites disaster. A retreat to strong ground can preserve an army long enough for the battle to change. Cemetery Hill's value came from its relationship to the surrounding landscape. Gettysburg sat among ridges and heights that would define the next 2 days. Seminary Ridge to the west, Cemetery Ridge extending from the Union position, Culp's Hill on the right, and farther south the high ground that would later draw fighting toward Little Round Top. On July 1st, not all of those places had yet become famous, but the framework was beginning to form. The Union Army, forced through the town, was being pushed not simply backward, but toward the terrain that would shape its defense. For civilians in and around Gettysburg, the transformation was immediate and terrifying. This was Pennsylvania, a Union state, and Lee's campaign had brought the war directly onto Northern soil. The approach of Confederate forces had already caused fear among African American residents of Gettysburg and the surrounding region, who fled because they feared capture and enslavement. The battle now added another layer of danger. The town was no longer merely near an invasion route. It was inside the path of fighting. One local figure, John Burns, an elderly Gettysburg civilian and veteran of the War of 1812, became part of the first day's story when he fought alongside Union troops and was wounded. His presence is a reminder that the battle did not unfold in empty country. Gettysburg was inhabited ground. People lived along these roads and streets. They knew the farms, the doorways, the turns through town, the rise toward the cemetery. On July 1st, those familiar places became a military corridor. The Confederate success that day was real. Union defenders had been forced from the ground west and north of Gettysburg. The town itself had been entered by the momentum of that success. But victory on one part of a battlefield is not the same as control of the battle's future. Robert E. Lee's army had driven its enemy back. George G. Meade's army, still arriving and concentrating under the pressure of the campaign, now had to make something durable out of the fallback position. That is why the retreat through Gettysburg deserves close attention. It was a moment of danger, but also of transition. The Union soldiers moving through town were not choosing the ideal battlefield in calm conditions. They were responding to pressure. They were carrying the consequences of the morning fight behind them. Yet the direction of their withdrawal placed them on ground that gave the Army of the Potomac a chance to recover. Cemetery Hill stood just beyond the town, and from there the shape of the coming battle began to appear. If the first day had begun with uncertainty near McPherson Ridge, it ended with a clearer question. Could the Union Army hold the high ground it had reached after being driven back? Could a position born from retreat become the foundation of resistance? The answer was not yet certain on the evening of July 1st. The battlefield was still expanding. The armies were still converging. Men who had marched toward Gettysburg on separate roads were now being drawn toward a single struggle over ridges, hills, and lines of defense. The Confederate Army had won the opening day's field fight, but the Union Army had not been swept from Gettysburg. It had fallen back through the town. It had reached Cemetery Hill. And in that movement, the battle changed from a fight over first contact into a contest for the high ground that would decide whether Gettysburg became a Confederate breakthrough or a Union stand. The movement to Cemetery Hill had begun as retreat, but by the evening of July 1st, 1863, it had become something else. In 500 sexes, it had become a line. That difference mattered. A retreat could dissolve. It could break apart in the streets, scatter along the roads, and leave an army with no center around which to gather. But the Union troops who fell back through Gettysburg did not simply vanish from the field. They moved toward high ground south of town, toward Cemetery Hill, and there the shape of the battle began to change. The first day had been a Confederate success. Union forces had been driven from the ridges and fields west and north of Gettysburg. The fight near McPherson Ridge had expanded, the pressure had increased, and the town itself had become part of the battlefield as Federal defenders withdrew through its streets. But battlefield victories can remain incomplete. They can open an opportunity without securing it. They can drive an enemy backward without destroying the position the enemy is about to occupy. That was the significance of Cemetery Hill. It stood just south of Gettysburg, close enough to the town that the retreating Union soldiers could reach it after the collapse of their first day positions. It was part of the high ground that would define the rest of the battle. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge stretching southward, Culp's Hill to the Union right, and farther along the line, ground that would include Little Round Top. These were not abstract features on a map. They were the physical framework around which the Union Army of the Potomac could form a defense. At Gettysburg, the land mattered because it gave shape to decision. The armies had converged because roads led them there, but once they arrived, roads alone no longer explained the struggle. Ridges, hills, fields, stone walls, boulder-strewn ground, and slopes began to determine what could be seen, what could be defended, and where an attack would have to move. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had gained the advantage on the first day, but the Union Army now held ground that was easier to defend than the broken position it had lost west and north of town. Cemetery Hill became an anchor. An anchor is not merely a high point. It is a place a line can hold to. It gives direction to troops arriving after confusion. It gives commanders a fixed position from which to extend a defense. And at Gettysburg, where both armies were still coming onto the field, that stability was essential. The battle was no longer just the result of first contact. It was becoming a concentration of armies, and the army that could form a coherent position first would gain a powerful advantage. The Union line that developed around Cemetery Hill was not a straight wall. It followed the land. From the high ground near Cemetery Hill, the position extended along Cemetery Ridge and connected toward other important features. To the right, Culp's Hill would become a key part of the defensive system. To the left, the line would eventually be tested near places whose names would become inseparable from the second day: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard. But on the evening of July 1st, the central fact was simpler and more immediate. The Union Army had been beaten back, but it still occupied the high ground south of Gettysburg. That gave Major General George G.M. Record Mary Hacktenecker, Meade, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, something essential, a battlefield on which his army could stand. Meade had not chosen Gettysburg as the intended place for a major battle. The collision had come from movement, uncertainty, and contact. But once the battle had begun, the ground itself imposed choices. To remain near Gettysburg meant holding the heights. To lose them might mean being forced away from the crossroads and leaving the Confederate Army with the advantage of both position and momentum. For General Robert E. Lee, the situation after the first day contained both success and danger. His army had driven Union troops from their first positions and through the town. Yet the Federal Army had not been broken. It had not been pushed entirely off the field. Instead, it had fallen back into a position that could absorb additional troops as they arrived. What had looked like a Confederate advance through victory now faced a Union line forming on commanding ground. This was the problem of Gettysburg after the first day. The Confederate Army had won much of the visible field, but the Union Army held the more valuable framework for what came next. Cemetery Hill also mattered because it linked the town to the larger battlefield. Gettysburg itself, with its 10 roads leading in, had drawn the armies together. But the fight would not be decided by possession of the town streets alone. The decisive ground lay around and beyond them. The town was a gateway. Cemetery Hill was a position. From there, the Union line could look outward across the approaches. It could become the hinge between the right and the center, between Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge, between the Army's survival after July 1st and its resistance on July 2nd and July 3rd. The language of high ground can sound simple, almost too simple. Armies want hills because hills are higher. But at Gettysburg, the value of high ground was practical. A defensive position on elevated terrain could force attackers to advance under observation and fire. It could make movement more difficult. It could allow a line to be organized around features that soldiers could recognize and commanders could use. High ground did not guarantee victory. The fighting over the next 2 days would prove that. But it gave the Union Army a structure that retreat alone could not provide. The shape that emerged is often remembered as a broad defensive line south of town, with Cemetery Hill near its center of gravity. Cemetery Ridge stretched south from that area. Culp's Hill guarded the Union right. Farther south, the ground near Little Round Top would become crucial to the Union left. Each feature would have its own crisis of soccer. Each would be tested. But they were connected by the fact that the Union Army, after the first day, had not simply been driven away. It had gathered onto a defensible landscape. That is why the end of July 1st cannot be understood only as a Confederate triumph. It was a triumph with an unresolved consequence. Lee's army had forced the Federals back, but in forcing them back, it had helped push them toward the ground on which they could make their stand. The fighting west and north of Gettysburg had decided the first phase of the battle. Cemetery Hill and the ridges around it would decide whether that first phase became the beginning of Confederate victory or the foundation of Union resistance. As darkness settled over the battlefield, the landscape held the memory of the day's violence. The fields near McPherson Ridge, the roads into Gettysburg, the streets through which soldiers had retreated, and the high ground south of town were now bound together in one unfolding battle. Men were still arriving. Commands were still being arranged. The question that had followed the Union retreat through the town now became the question of the whole field. Could this line hold? The answer would not come in a single moment. It would come through repeated attacks across different parts of the Union position, against hills, fields, ridges, and flanks. The Confederate Army would look for weakness. The Union Army would try to keep its defensive shape intact. Cemetery Hill had given the Federal position an anchor, but an anchor must be tested before its strength is known. On July 2nd, 1863, the battle would widen again. The struggle would move across the Union line, toward Culp's Hill on the right, toward Cemetery Ridge in the center, and toward the difficult ground of Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard on the left and center left. The high ground that had saved the Union Army from collapse on the first evening would now become the object of a far larger test. The line that had formed after the first day was not simply a place where tired men stopped. By the morning of July 2nd, 1863, it had become the central question of Gettysburg. The Union Army of the Potomac, under Major General George G. Meade, held the high ground south of town. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under General Robert E. Halloway. Lee faced it from the west and north. Between them lay ridges, fields, stone walls, wooded slopes, boulder-strewn ground, and roads that had drawn both armies here without either commander choosing Gettysburg as the intended battlefield. The first day had ended with Confederate success on the fields west and north of town. Union troops had been driven back through Gettysburg, but they had not been destroyed. They had reached Cemetery Hill. From there, the Federal position took shape across the ground that would now matter most. Cemetery Hill stood as an anchor. Cemetery Ridge stretched southward. Culp's Hill guarded the Union right. Farther to the south, the ground rose again toward Little Round Top, with rough country around Devil's Den and contested open spaces near the Wheatfield and the Peach Orchard. On a map, these names can appear fixed and orderly, as if the battle simply moved from point to point. But on the ground, each place was part of a larger problem. The Union Army had to hold a connected defensive line. It was not enough to defend one hill or one ridge in isolation. A flank turned in one place could threaten the whole position. A breach along the center could divide the army. A lost height could give the enemy a way to look down into ground that had seemed protected only hours before. This is why the second day mattered so deeply. July 2nd was not one battle in one field. It was a test spread across the entire Union shape. Lee's attacks pressed against key positions from the left of the Federal line to the right. The day became a struggle over flanks and high ground, over whether the Federal position could bend without breaking, and over whether the Confederate Army could turn the success of the first day into a decisive rupture. The landscape south of Gettysburg forced both armies to think in terms of connection. Cemetery Hill could not stand as an anchor if the line attached to it collapsed. Cemetery Ridge could not serve as a center if the ground on either side became untenable. Culp's Hill mattered because it formed a key Union right flank position. Little Round Top mattered because it stood on the Union left, where Confederate attacks threatened the end of the Federal line. Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard mattered because they lay in the difficult zone between the Union left and center left, where open fields, uneven ground, and boulders turned movement into danger and defense into a matter of minutes. The Confederate challenge was clear in its broad purpose, even when the fighting itself became confused and local. Lee needed to test the Union Army where it had taken position after the first day. He had moved into Pennsylvania to shift pressure away from Virginia and threaten Northern territory. Now, on the second day at Gettysburg, the campaign had narrowed to this uneven ground. The question was whether Meade's army could be forced from it. For Meade, the situation was equally stark. He had taken command of the Army of the Potomac during a campaign already in motion. He had not selected Gettysburg as the site of a planned set-piece battle. But by July 2nd, the issue was no longer whether Gettysburg was the perfect battlefield. It was whether the army could make use of the ground it held. The high positions south of town offered defensive advantages, But those advantages depended on cohesion. The Union line had to remain a line. That is the quiet tension of the second morning. The first day had been violent and chaotic, but its result was visible. The Federal Army was on the high ground. The Confederate Army had won the opening field fight, but had not taken the final position. The second day began with both sides facing the consequences of that unfinished result. To the south, Little Round Top stood as one of the most important features on the Union left. It was not merely a hill with a name that would later become famous. It was high ground at the edge of the Federal position. If that flank failed, the danger was not only local. A threat from that direction could endanger the larger Union line around Gettysburg. Heavy fighting there on July 2nd would make Little Round Top one of the defining places of the battle. Near it lay Devil's Den, a boulder-strewn area whose very terrain seemed to resist order. In such ground, lines could break apart. Men could disappear behind rocks and folds in the land. Movement could become fragmented, and command could become difficult. The struggle there belonged to the same larger contest for the Union left, where the Confederate effort pressed against positions that could not be allowed to unravel. Beyond that rough ground, the fighting spread through places whose names now carry the weight of what happened there: the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Ridge. The Wheatfield and the Peach Orchard were connected to the struggle on the Union left and center left, part of the same broad pressure that sought to break or bend the Federal position. Cemetery Ridge, running through the center of the Union line, would become even more central to the story of Gettysburg by the third day. But on July 2nd, it was already part of the defensive framework that had grown out of the retreat from town. On the other end of the line stood Culp's Hill. If Little Round Top was the vulnerable high ground of the Union left, Culp's Hill was a key position on the Union right. Fighting there on July 2nd and July 3rd would show that the battle was never only about one flank. Lee's army tested both ends of the Federal position. Meade's army had to defend not just the famous heights, but the entire structure of its ground. The second day, therefore, unfolded as a widening examination of the battlefield created on the first. Gettysburg's road network had pulled armies toward the town. The first day had driven Union defenders back through its streets to Cemetery Hill. The evening had produced a defensive shape. Now the shape was placed under pressure. What makes this day so important is that it did not resolve itself in one clear dramatic stroke. It built through repeated fighting, through separate places tied together by consequence. If Little Round Top fell, the Union left might be endangered. If Culp's Hill fell, the Union right could be compromised. If Cemetery Ridge could be broken, the center might not hold. Each part mattered because each part touched the whole. By the close of July 2nd, the names on the southern and eastern edges of Gettysburg would no longer be only features of Pennsylvania farmland. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill would become part of the battle's permanent language. They would mark the places where Lee tried to crack the Union position and where Meade's army fought to keep its line from coming apart. The second day opened with the memory of retreat still fresh, but also with the Union army in possession of the high ground that had saved it from disaster. That ground now had to prove its worth under attack. The first day had determined where the armies would stand. The second would determine whether that stand could survive. And on the Union left, where the line reached toward Little Round Top, the test would become especially severe. There, a height that might have seemed like one feature among many, would become a hinge of the battlefield, a place where the fate of the Federal position could be measured in the struggle for the slope beneath it. The Union left had not been chosen in calm. Like so much at Gettysburg, it had been shaped by movement, pressure, and the urgent need to make a line out of whatever ground the army could hold. By July 2nd, 1863, Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac stood along the high ground south of Gettysburg, with Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the hills beyond forming the defensive framework that had grown out of the first day's retreat. At the far end of that framework was Little Round Top. It was not the largest feature on the battlefield, and it was not the only height that mattered. Gettysburg was a landscape of ridges, hills, roads, farms, stone walls, and uneven fields. But Little Round Top had a particular importance because of where it stood. It lay on the Union left, at the edge of the Federal position. If that edge were turned, the danger was not simply that one hill would be lost. The danger was that the entire line around Gettysburg could be placed in jeopardy. That is why Little Round Top became more than terrain. It became a hinge. The shape of the Union position after July 1st depended on connected high ground. Cemetery Hill had provided the anchor after Federal troops were driven back through Gettysburg, Florida. Cemetery Ridge extended the line southward. Culp's Hill helped secure the Union right. Together, these positions gave Meade a defensive arrangement that made sense in military terms. The Army did not have to attack across the whole field. It could receive attacks from ground that offered observation, organization, and a stronger position than the open approaches below. But every defensive line has ends. If the enemy can get around one of those ends, the strongest ridge can become a trap. Troops facing forward can suddenly be threatened from the side or rear. Roads of retreat can become uncertain. Artillery positions and infantry supports can be forced to shift under pressure. A line that looked solid from the front can begin to come apart from the flank. On July 2nd, that was the danger on the Union left. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had won important ground on the first day, driving Union forces from positions west and north of town. But the Confederate victory had not destroyed the Army of the Potomac. Meade's troops still held the heights south of Gettysburg. Lee now had to decide whether that position could be broken. His attacks on the second day would test the Union line across several places, from the left near Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard, to the right at Culp's Hill. Little Round Top mattered because it stood over this wider struggle. Its control affected the security of the Union flank and the stability of the line extending back towards Cemetery Ridge. If Confederate forces could take the high ground at the end of the Federal position, they might threaten the rest of the Union Army from a direction it could not safely ignore. The fight there was therefore not isolated. It was connected to the larger Confederate effort to crack Meade's line by pressure on its edges and vulnerable points. The fighting on Little Round Top was heavy. The phrase can sound simple, almost too small for what it contains. Heavy fighting meant men climbing and holding difficult ground under fire. It meant units trying to maintain order while the shape of the land broke formations apart. It meant commanders and soldiers understanding, sometimes only in the moment, that the ground beneath them was tied to the fate of the army behind them. The importance of the hill came from the relationship between elevation and flank. High ground allowed an army to see, to place men and guns with purpose, and to resist attacks moving upward. At Gettysburg, the Union Army's survival after the first day had depended on getting to ground that could be defended. By the second day, the question was whether that high ground could remain intact from end to end. Little Round Top was one of the places where that question became immediate. For the Confederate attackers, the opportunity was clear enough in principle. The Union line had an exposed left and artery. If that left could be overwhelmed or turned, then the battlefield might change. The fight would no longer be only against the face of Cemetery Ridge or the high position at Cemetery Hill. It could become a fight along the length of the Union position, with Federal troops forced to respond to a threat from the flank. For the Union defenders, the need was equally clear. Little Round Top could not be treated as a distant outpost with no consequence. Its loss could have endangered the position that had been built since the evening of July 1st. Holding it helped protect the Army's left and preserve the defensive system Meade needed in order to survive Lee's attacks. The drama of Little Round Top lies partly in that compression. Across the battlefield, thousands of men were fighting in multiple sectors. The second day at Gettysburg was not a single clash, but a series of connected crises. Yet on the Union left, the meaning of the day could be narrowed to a slope and a flank. If the line failed there, the consequences might travel far beyond that hill. This is one of the reasons Gettysburg's geography has remained so central to how the battle is remembered. The names are not merely labels. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard describe a military problem written into the land. Armies do not fight on maps alone. They fight through fields, over ridges, around rocks, along roads, and against positions that become valuable because of the danger they prevent. Little Round Top prevented a danger that could have become catastrophic. The Union Army had already experienced the shock of being driven back. On July 1st, the movement through Gettysburg could have become collapse. Instead, it ended on high ground. That was the beginning of the Federal defensive position. On July 2nd, the Confederates tried to test whether that position was as strong as it appeared. At Little Round Top, the test came against the left flank, where the end of the line had to hold against the possibility of being turned. The hill's importance also reveals something larger about Meade's situation. He had taken command of the Army of the Potomac only shortly before the battle. He did not choose Gettysburg as the planned place for a decisive fight. Yet by the second day, he had to manage a battle in which the landscape itself dictated urgent priorities. To hold Gettysburg, he did not need every acre. He needed the right ground. He needed the Army's line to remain connected. He needed the flanks to survive. Little Round Top was one of those necessary places. Lee's problem was the mirror image. The Confederate Army had come north to shift pressure away from Virginia and threaten Union territory. But once the armies collided at Gettysburg, Lee faced an enemy positioned on defensible high ground. If he could break that position, the campaign might still produce a dramatic result. If he could not, the invasion of the North would face a hard limit in the fields and ridges around this Pennsylvania town. The fighting at Little Round Top did not end the battle. It did not even end the violence of July 2nd. But it helped determine whether the Union left would remain part of a living line or become an opening through which Confederate pressure could widen. In that sense, the Hill's defense helped preserve the shape of the Federal Army at the moment when that shape was under severe strain. Around it, the battle continued to burn. Below and nearby, the struggle spread through the rough ground of Devil's Den and into the contested fields beyond. The Union left was not a single point, and Little Round Top was not the only place where men fought and fell on July 2nd. The same Confederate effort that threatened the Hill also drove violence into the boulder-strewn ground and the fields that would become part of Gettysburg's permanent memory. Little Round Top held its place in the line, but the fight for the Union left was still unfolding, moving through rock, field, and orchard, where the pressure on Meade's army would remain fierce and where the cost of holding Gettysburg would continue to rise. Below Little Round Top, the ground changed character. The hill had offered height, a commanding slope, and a clear military question. If the Union left was turned there, the whole Federal position might be endangered. But at its base and beyond it, the battlefield became less orderly. It broke into rocks, low ground, fields, and farm lanes. It became a place where lines were harder to see, where formations could be pulled apart by terrain, smoke, and pressure, and where the fighting on July 2nd, 1863, became some of the most intense of the battle. This was the country around Devil's Den and the Wheatfield. Devil's Den was not a ridge in the same sense as Cemetery Ridge, and it was not a summit like Little Round Top. It was boulder-strewn ground, a rough maze of stone near the Union left. Its very shape mattered. In war, ground is never only a backdrop. It decides what men can see, where guns can be placed, how quickly units can move, and how easily a commander can understand what is happening. At Devil's Den, the rocks fractured the field of vision. They offered cover, but they also created confusion. A place that might have seemed strange or picturesque in peace became, under fire, a broken chamber of violence. The Confederate attacks on this part of the field were part of the wider effort by General Robert E. Germ, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, to break Major General George G. Brand, Meade's Union line. On the second day at Gettysburg, Lee's assaults did not fall on one isolated point. They tested a system: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill. Each place had its own shape, its own tactical meaning. But together they formed the living edge of a much larger struggle. If the Union left or center-left gave way, the position built after the retreat through Gettysburg on July 1st could be torn open. Devil's Den belonged to that danger. From the Confederate side, pressure against the Union left was meant to do more than seize difficult ground. It was meant to unmake the Federal line. The Union Army held the high ground south of Gettysburg, but that high ground was not a wall of stone. It was a defensive position made of ridges, hills, fields, roads, and men. It depended on connection. It depended on one part of the line supporting another. The fighting at Devil's Den threatened those connections because it took place near the hinge between the high ground of Little Round Top and the more open, exposed areas stretching toward the peach orchard and the Wheatfield. The names sound almost pastoral. The Wheatfield, the peach orchard. They suggest cultivation, seasons, fruit, and grain. But on July 2nd, they became military landmarks because armies moved through them, fought over them, and left them marked by loss. The farm landscape around Gettysburg had been pulled into the machinery of the campaign. Roads had brought the armies toward the town. Ridges had shaped their lines. Now fields and orchards became contested ground in a battle neither Lee nor Meade had originally planned to fight there. The Wheatfield, like Devil's Den, was part of the pressure zone on the Union left and center left. It was not simply a location beside the main battle. It was one of the places where the second day's design revealed itself. Confederate forces striking hard against the Federal position, Union troops trying to hold or restore a line, and the battle widening beyond any single dramatic height. The fighting here was connected to the struggle for Little Round Top, but it was not subordinate to it. It had its own gravity. The Wheatfield mattered because it lay in the contested belt between the Union's left flank and the line running back toward Cemetery Ridge. If that belt collapsed, the Union position would become less like a curved defensive line and more like a series of disconnected fragments. The danger was not only that men might be forced from one field. The danger was that the Federal Army might lose the coherence it had built after the first day. Gettysburg had already shown how quickly a position could change. On July 1st, Union troops had been driven back through the town, yet they had found an anchor on Cemetery Hill. On July 2nd, the question was whether that anchor could hold when its flanks and approaches were attacked in force. The peach orchard added another layer to the fight. It sat in the same broad zone of conflict on the Union center left. Its importance came from its position within the battlefield's shifting geometry. The Confederate effort against the peach orchard, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den was not a set of unrelated clashes. These places formed a chain of pressure. Fighting at one point affected the others. A break near the peach orchard could expose ground towards Cemetery Ridge. Pressure through the Wheatfield could deepen the strain on the Union left. Fighting among the rocks of Devil's Den could threaten the approaches below Little Round Top. The battlefield was connected, even when smoke and terrain made those connections difficult for soldiers to see. That is one of the quiet truths of Gettysburg's second day. The battle was not experienced by most men as a complete map. It was experienced in pieces: a stone wall, a slope, a patch of trees, a field, an order shouted through noise, an unseen line giving way somewhere beyond view. Yet decisions made in those pieces could alter the fate of the whole army. The Union position depended on men holding local ground long enough for the larger line to survive. The Confederate effort depended on turning local success into a wider rupture. At Devil's Den, the roughness of the landscape made the fighting feel close and immediate. In the Wheatfield and around the peach orchard, the open, cultivated ground exposed men to the terrible directness of Civil War combat. These were not symbolic places to those who entered them. They were real ground under real fire, and their names entered memory because the cost there was so high. Gettysburg's total casualties over the 3 days would reach roughly 51,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The fighting on July 2nd helped drive the battle toward that grim scale. For Meade's Army of the Potomac, survival on the left and center left meant preventing Confederate pressure from turning local success into general collapse. Holding Little Round Top was essential, but it did not end the crisis. The Union line had to absorb blows across a wider front. Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the peach orchard show why the second day cannot be reduced to one hill, however important that hill was. The battlefield was a system under attack. Its strength depended on whether its parts could endure separately and still remain connected. For Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the same terrain offered opportunity and frustration. The Union line could be struck at multiple points, and on July 2nd, the Confederate attacks drove deep violence into the Federal left and center left. But the difficulty lay in transforming pressure into decision. Gettysburg's ground resisted simplicity. Low ridges, boulder fields, orchards, fields, and hills shaped movement and delayed clarity. A gain in one place did not automatically become a break in the whole line. The Union Army bent, suffered, and was forced to meet crisis after crisis, but it did not give up the defensive framework that had formed after the first day. That framework was still centered on the high ground south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the connected positions that guarded the Union Army's flanks. Devil's Den and the Wheatfield were part of the struggle to determine whether that framework could be pried apart. The violence there was local, but its meaning was larger. It belonged to the same day that saw the Union left tested near Little Round Top and the Union center left strained around the Peach Orchard. It belonged to Lee's attempt to break Meade's army before it could fully settle into strength. By the time the fighting in these places entered memory, their names had changed. Devil's Den was no longer only a formation of rocks. The Wheatfield was no longer only a field. The Peach Orchard was no longer only cultivated ground on a Pennsylvania farm. They had become points on a national map of sacrifice, places where the second day of Gettysburg revealed its ferocity. And still, the battle was not confined to the left. While the Union left and center-left absorbed some of the fiercest fighting of July 2nd, the Federal position had another end, another flank, and another set of heights that could not be lost without danger. Across the battlefield, on the Union right, Culp's Hill stood as part of the same defensive system. The second day was testing the whole line, not only the ground of rocks, fields, and orchards. If Gettysburg was to remain a Union position, it had to hold from one end to the other. Across the battlefield from the rocks and fields of the Union left, the ground rose again into another kind of importance. Culp's Hill did not carry the same later drama in public memory as Little Round Top, and it did not offer the same open spectacle that would define the fields before Cemetery Ridge. It stood on the Union right, part of the high ground south and southeast of Gettysburg, and its value came from its place in the whole Federal position. If Cemetery Hill was the anchor after the first day, and Cemetery Ridge stretched the Union line southward, Culp's Hill helped protect the other end of that line. That mattered because the Battle of Gettysburg was not a series of isolated scenes. It was one connected struggle over position. By July 2nd, 1863, Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac had taken shape along the high ground after the retreat through Gettysburg on the first day. The Federal Army had been battered west and north of town, but it had not been destroyed. It had fallen back to ground that could be defended. The hills and ridges south of Gettysburg gave the Union Army a framework, a way to hold together under pressure. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia now had to test that framework. On the left, Confederate attacks had struck toward Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard. Those names would become some of the most familiar in the story of Gettysburg, because the fighting there was intense and the threat was obvious. If the Union left could be turned, the Federal line might be rolled up from the end. Meade's army might be forced from the high ground. The battle might change direction. But the same danger existed on the other end. Culp's Hill was part of the Union right flank. It helped guard the line near Cemetery Hill and the approaches around the eastern side of the Federal position. To lose it would not simply mean losing a hill. It would mean opening the right of Meade's army to Confederate pressure at a point where the Union position depended on connection. A defensive line is only as strong as its ability to remain whole. If one end collapses, the rest of the line can be threatened from the side, even if the center still stands. This is why the second day at Gettysburg cannot be understood only by looking left. The fighting on July 2nd was a battle for both flanks. It was a test of whether the Army of the Potomac could hold a broad defensive position under coordinated pressure from Lee's army. The ground itself had become a system. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, and Culp's Hill were not separate landmarks in the moment of battle. They were connected pieces of a defensive arc around Gettysburg. Each point mattered because of how it related to the others. Culp's Hill was fought over on July 2nd and again on July 3rd. That alone tells us something important about the battle's rhythm. The struggle there did not end neatly with the sunset of the second day. It carried forward into the final day, just as Gettysburg itself carried forward from one crisis to the next. The armies were not resetting into clean chapters. They were enduring a continuous contest in which unfinished fights shaped the decisions still to come. For the soldiers on the Union right, the great movements elsewhere did not make their ground less important. While attention could be drawn toward the smoke and violence around the Union left, their own position remained essential. They were holding one of the hinges of Meade's line. If Culp's Hill gave way, the consequences might reach beyond the hill itself. Cemetery Hill, the position that had saved the Union Army from complete disaster after the first day, could be placed in greater danger. The Federal hold on the high ground could be compromised. The importance of Culp's Hill also reminds us that Gettysburg was shaped by the geography of Adams County in ways no commander had fully planned. The armies had converged on the town because roads led them there. The first shots had been fired west of Gettysburg near McPherson Ridge, not because either Lee or Meade had selected the town for a decisive battle, but because the campaign brought moving columns into contact. Then, after the Union retreat through town, the high ground became the basis for everything that followed since. By the second day, the battlefield had become a contest over whether that accidental position could become a successful one. Meade's army had the advantage of the defensive ground, but that advantage had to be proven under attack. It was not enough to occupy Cemetery Hill, or to hold a ridge, or to place troops on a slope. The line had to remain intact when Confederate attacks pressed against it. Men had to stand where the map said the army needed them. Hills had to become barriers. Roads and farms and wooded slopes had to become parts of a military structure strong enough to survive. Culp's Hill was one of those places where landscape and endurance met. The fighting there showed that the Union right could not be treated as quiet background to the better-known struggle on the left. It was another front in the same crisis. Lee's army was searching for weakness. Meade's army was trying to deny it. The battle unfolded across a wide field of pressure, from the boulder-strewn ground near Devil's Den to the slopes of Little Round Top, from the fields and orchards on the left to the heights protecting the right. Everywhere, the question was the same. Could the Union line hold? On July 2nd, the answer was not given all at once. It emerged in fragments, in places where attacks were met, where positions were lost or retained, where the shape of the line bent but did not fully break. On the Union left, the defense of Little Round Top prevented a dangerous turning movement. In the center left, the fighting around the Wheatfield and the peach orchard consumed men and ground with terrible speed. On the Union right, Culp's Hill became another measure of survival. And because the fight at Culp's Hill extended into July 3rd, it connects the second day to the last day in a direct way. Before Lee's final major assault against the Union center, the battlefield had already demonstrated something. The flanks had been tested. The ends of the Federal position had been struck. The high ground had been contested, yet Meade's army still remained in place. That fact would matter deeply. Gettysburg's second day had been violent across the field, but it had not produced the collapse Lee needed. The Union position still stretched across the high ground south of town. Cemetery Hill still mattered. Culp's Hill had not ceased to matter. Little Round Top still guarded the left. The defensive system, strained and bloodied, had survived. From that survival came the next terrible possibility. If the flanks could not be broken, then attention would turn toward the line between them. The ground of Cemetery Ridge, already part of the Union defensive framework, would become the focus of Lee's final effort. The struggle for Culp's Hill helps explain why. By the time the battle moved toward its climactic assault, Gettysburg had already shown the cost of trying to tear the Union position apart at the edges. What remained was the center, the long Federal line on Cemetery Ridge, waiting under the weight of what the first 2 days had made inevitable. The Union line had survived at its edges, but survival did not bring quiet. It brought a new kind of danger. By the morning of July 3rd, 1863, the shape of the battlefield around Gettysburg had become clearer than it had been when the armies first collided west of town. The fight had begun near McPherson Ridge, moved through Gettysburg, settled onto Cemetery Hill, and then spread across the heights, fields, rocks, and wooded slopes south and southeast of town. What had started as an unexpected meeting engagement had hardened into a contest over a defensive system. At the heart of that system was Cemetery Ridge. It was not the tallest ground on the field, It did not rise with the visual drama of Little Round Top, and it did not carry the wooded strength of Culp's Hill. It was a long, lower ridge, part of the high ground held by Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac after the retreat through Gettysburg on the first day of conversation. But its importance came from position. Cemetery Ridge helped connect the Union left, anchored near Little Round Top, with the higher ground around Cemetery Hill and the Union right at Culp's Hill. It was the line between the flanks. It was the center of the Federal position. Across from it stood Seminary Ridge, the ground associated with the Confederate line after the battle had taken shape. Between these ridges lay the open ground that would soon become one of the most remembered spaces in American military history. The geography was simple enough to understand and terrible enough to matter. One army held one ridge. The other occupied the opposite ridge. Between them stretched fields and fences, roads and low rises, the kind of civilian landscape that war had transformed into a killing ground. Gettysburg's landscape had been doing that from the beginning. The town itself, in Adams County, Pennsylvania, had drawn forces toward it because roads led there from many directions. The American Battlefield Trust notes that 10 roads led into Gettysburg, and that road network had helped pull 2 armies into a place neither Robert E. Octar and Massachusetts, Lee nor George G. Meade had originally selected for a major battle. But once the armies were there, the roads were no longer the only decisive features. The ridges became the frame of battle. The hills became anchors. The farms, stone walls, and fields became lines of approach or places of defense. Cemetery Ridge mattered because it turned the Union Army's retreat on July 1st into something more than a withdrawal. When Federal troops fell back through Gettysburg toward Cemetery Hill, they did not simply escape destruction. They reached ground from which a new line could be built. Cemetery Hill gave the position its first strength. From there, the Federal line extended southward along Cemetery Ridge and eastward toward Culp's Hill. By July 2nd, Meade's army stood in a rough defensive arc around the town, with the Confederates facing it from the west and north. That shape mattered. It allowed the Union Army to defend a connected position rather than a scatter of isolated hills. It also meant that Lee's options were shaped by what had already failed. On July 2nd, Confederate attacks had pressed hard against the Union left, where Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard became part of a violent struggle to damage or break the Federal line. At the same time, the Union right at Culp's Hill had also been tested. The second day was not a single blow in one place. It was an effort across the battlefield to find weakness in the Federal position. But when the smoke and darkness of that day gave way to the third morning, the Union Army was still there. Little Round Top remained in Union hands. Culp's Hill had not been lost. Cemetery Hill still formed a key part of the defensive framework. The Federal line had bent, suffered, and been forced to react under enormous pressure, but it had not collapsed. For Lee, that fact created a strategic and emotional problem. His army, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, had moved north into Pennsylvania after the victory at Chancellorsville, seeking to shift pressure away from Virginia and threaten Northern territory. The campaign had brought Confederate forces deep onto Union soil. But now, at Gettysburg, the battle had become fixed. The opportunity for decisive success depended on breaking Meade's army where it stood. If the flanks had resisted him, the center remained. Cemetery Ridge, then, became more than ground. It became a question. Could the Union center be struck with enough force to split the Army of the Potomac? Could a direct assault accomplish what the attacks on the left and right had not? Could the Confederate Army cross the exposed space between the ridges and break the Federal line at its middle? These were not abstract questions. They were questions of distance, terrain, and human endurance. The ground before Cemetery Ridge was open enough that an attacking force would have to move under observation and fire. It was wide enough that the march itself would become part of the ordeal. American Battlefield Trust describes the assault that followed as leaving a roughly 3/4-mile trail of casualties across open ground before Cemetery Ridge. That distance, measured in calm words after the fact, meant something very different to the men who would cross it. It meant time under fire. It meant formations trying to hold together in the open. It meant advancing toward a ridge where the defenders were waiting. For Meade, Cemetery Ridge offered the central advantage of a defensive position. His army did not need to move forward to win the moment. It needed to hold. The Army of the Potomac had been forced into battle at Gettysburg, but by the third day, it occupied ground that gave it a coherent line. The ridge helped make that possible. The Union center was not detached from the rest of the army. It was part of the same defensive system that tied Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, and Culp's Hill into one battlefield position. This is why the earlier fighting matters when the story turns toward the center. The assault against Cemetery Ridge did not arise in isolation. It came after the first day had driven Union forces back but failed to destroy them. It came after the second day had tested the left and the right without producing the collapse Lee needed. It came after the battlefield had revealed both the strength of Meade's line and the cost of attacking it. The ridge also carried a quieter significance. Unlike the dramatic boulders of Devil's Den or the wooded slopes of Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge was not defined by a single striking feature. Its power was in continuity. It connected. It held the middle. It gave the Union Army a spine along the high ground south of Gettysburg. To break it would be to threaten the whole position. To fail against it would leave Lee with few choices. By July 3rd, the battle had already become one of the defining clashes of the Civil War, though the men on the field could not yet know how it would be remembered. They knew the immediate facts: the heat of July, the exhaustion of 2 days of combat, the dead and wounded around the farms and ridges, the pressure of command, the uncertainty of what would come. They knew that Gettysburg had not been planned as the place for this vast collision, but it had become the place where both armies were committed. Cemetery Ridge waited in the center of that commitment. For the Confederates, the line across the open ground represented risk and possibility. For the Union soldiers holding the ridge, it represented the place where the army had to stand. Behind the ridge lay the meaning of everything gained since the retreat through town, the chance to hold the high ground, to withstand Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, and to keep the Army of the Potomac intact. In front of it lay the exposed fields between the ridges, soon to be filled with marching men. The final major assault at Gettysburg would be remembered by the name Pickett's Charge. But before it was a name, before it became an image in memory, before Paul Philippeteau would later make it the central drama of the Gettysburg cyclorama, it was a decision aimed at a place. That place was the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. The flanks had held. The line remained. And across the open ground, the next movement of the battle was gathering. The movement gathering across the fields did not begin as legend. It began as men forming under command, facing a distance that could be measured in land and time. Between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge lay open ground, roughly 3/4 of a mile of exposure. It was not an abstraction to the soldiers who would cross it. It was field, fence, slope, and sky. It was the space between a Confederate hope and a Union line that had already survived 2 days of testing. On July 3rd, 1863, General Robert E. Luther Vane. Lee turned toward the Union center. The attacks on the flanks had not broken the Federal position. Little Round Top had held. Culp's Hill had held. The Union Army, under Major General George G. Meade, still occupied the defensive framework that had grown out of the retreat through Gettysburg on the first day. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the connected high ground still gave the Army of the Potomac a line that could receive an attack rather than search for one. For Lee, the center now became the point of decision. The Union line on Cemetery Ridge was not the highest or most dramatic ground on the battlefield, but it was essential. It tied the position together. If the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia could break through there, the Federal formation might be split, and the meaning of the first 2 days could change in a single afternoon. The battle had opened unexpectedly west of Gettysburg, near McPherson Ridge. It had passed through the town and settled onto the heights. Now, the last great Confederate effort would be directed against the ridge that held the Union middle. The assault would be remembered as Pickett's Charge. The name has become one of the most familiar phrases of the Civil War, but it can also narrow the view. What mattered at the time was not memory, not the later painting of the scene, not the way Paul Philippeteau would make this moment central to the Gettysburg cyclorama. What mattered was the act itself. Confederate infantry moving out across open fields toward a prepared Union center. From the Confederate side, the advance required discipline before it required contact. Men had to leave the relative cover of their own ridge and step into a space where distance worked against them. The ground between the ridges did not protect an attacking line. It revealed it. With each movement forward, the assaulting troops came nearer to the Federal defenders on Cemetery Ridge and farther from the position from which they had begun. That distance is one reason the charge became so powerful in memory. It was not a sudden collision in woods or broken ground. It was visible. It unfolded across a wide, exposed approach. The American Battlefield Trust describes Pickett's charge as leaving a roughly 3/4-mile trail of casualties across open ground before Cemetery Ridge. That phrase captures both the geography and the consequence. The route of advance became a route of loss. For the Union soldiers on Cemetery Ridge, the meaning of the moment was equally clear. The first day's retreat through Gettysburg had not ended the battle because the Army found and held high ground. The second day's fighting had not broken the Army because the flanks, though battered, survived. Now the center had to stand. The ridge was not merely a line on a map. It was the place where the Army of the Potomac had to prove that its position was more than temporary shelter after defeat. It had to become a wall against Lee's final attempt. The landscape made the confrontation severe. Cemetery Ridge was part of a low, defensive rise, not an unreachable mountain. The fields before it were open enough that the attackers could be seen coming, but that visibility carried no mercy. The Confederate infantry had to cross the ground before it could do the work assigned to it. The Union line had to remain steady long enough to receive the blow. In that space between movement and impact, the battle compressed. 3 days of roads, ridges, marches, mistakes, and decisions narrowed toward the Union center. Pickett's charge was not simply an isolated, heroic episode. It was the consequence of what had already failed. Lee had entered Pennsylvania in a campaign meant to shift pressure away from Virginia and threaten Northern territory. The Army of Northern Virginia had converged in the Gettysburg region after movements through Pennsylvania, including concentration near Chambersburg to the west. The battle itself had not been chosen in advance by either army, but once it began, each day created the next. The first day put the Union on the heights. The second day tested whether those heights could be turned from the left or the right. The third day brought the attempt to pierce the middle. That is why the repulse mattered so deeply. When the Confederate assault against Cemetery Ridge failed, it did more than end an attack. It ended Lee's practical chance to win the battle at Gettysburg. The Union line remained unbroken. The Army of the Potomac still held the central ground. The Confederate Army had spent its final major effort and had not achieved the breakthrough it needed. In military terms, the failed charge marked the practical end of the battle. Fighting and danger did not vanish in an instant. The battlefield still held the wounded, the dying, the stunned survivors, and the broken formations of 3 days of combat. But the central question had been answered. Lee's army had attacked the Union left, the Union right, and now the Union center. The high ground still belonged to Meade's army. The consequences reached beyond the fields before Cemetery Ridge. Lee's second invasion of the North had been stopped on Pennsylvania soil. Gettysburg had drawn 2 armies into a town where 10 roads met, and over 3 days the surrounding landscape had become a test of whether the Confederacy could turn movement into decisive victory. After Pickett's charge, that possibility had receded. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia would withdraw from Gettysburg, and the campaign that had carried war into the North would come to an end. But on the afternoon of July 3rd, the meaning was first visible in human terms. Across the open ground, the charge left its terrible evidence. Men who had stepped out in formation lay scattered across the fields. The space between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge had become a measure of courage, command, and miscalculation. It had also become a measure of the battle's cost. The Union victory at the center did not feel clean. No victory at Gettysburg could. The Army of the Potomac had held, but holding had required losses on ridges, in fields, among rocks, through town streets, and along defensive lines that had been built under pressure. The Confederate Army had failed to break the position, but its soldiers had paid for the attempt in the open ground before Cemetery Ridge. By the time the charge was repulsed, the battle was no longer only a question of who held which ridge. It was also a question of how much had been spent to decide it. Gettysburg would be remembered as the battle that halted Lee's invasion and helped preserve the Union cause in one of the war's defining moments. Yet that memory rests on the scale of suffering left behind. The practical end of the battle came with the failure of Pickett's charge. The human reckoning was only beginning. Across 3 days, the fields, hills, roads, farms, and streets around Gettysburg had absorbed losses so great that they would shape how the battle was counted, buried, remembered, and understood. The human reckoning began in the quiet after the guns. For 3 days, Gettysburg had been measured in ridges, roads, hills, orchards, fields, and stone walls. By the end of July 3rd, 1863, it had to be measured another way, in bodies, in wounds, in missing men, in prisoners, in families waiting far beyond Pennsylvania for news that might never come clearly. The Battle of Gettysburg produced roughly 51,000 total casualties. That word, casualty, can sound distant until it is opened. It includes the killed. It includes the wounded. It includes the captured and the missing. It is not a single kind of loss, but a broad accounting of what battle does to an army. Some men lay dead on ground they had crossed only hours before. Some were carried or helped away. Some were left where they fell until others could reach them. Some disappeared into the confusion of retreat, capture, or incomplete records. Together, they formed one of the largest human costs of the American Civil War. The scale becomes even sharper when placed beside the armies that fought there. The Union Army of the Potomac, under Major General George G. Magna. Meade numbered about 94,000 troops. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under General Robert E. W. F. Lee, numbered more than 71,000. These were not small detached forces colliding by accident and then moving on. They were the principal field armies of the war in the Eastern Theater, brought together around Gettysburg by roads, pressure, uncertainty, and command decisions made over weeks of campaigning. By the end, the Union Army had suffered about 23,000 casualties. The Confederate Army had suffered about 28,000. The numbers were not equal, but both were severe. For Meade's army, victory had come with a cost that cut deeply into the force that held Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top, and the ground south of town. For Lee's army, defeat had come with losses that were even heavier in proportion, striking an army far from its Virginia base after a campaign meant to relieve pressure on the Confederacy and carry danger into Northern territory. This is one reason Gettysburg became a defining battle. Its importance cannot be separated from the casualty lists. Strategy explains why Lee moved north after Chancellorsville, why Pennsylvania mattered, why a victory on Northern soil might have changed the pressure on the war. Terrain explains why the high ground around Gettysburg mattered, why the Union line from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge could become so strong, and why the open ground before the Union center was so deadly. But the human cost explains why the battle could not be treated as a passing engagement. Gettysburg consumed men at a scale that forced both armies, and the nation watching them, to understand that something enormous had happened there. The cost was spread across the entire battlefield. It began west of Gettysburg, near McPherson Ridge, on July 1st, when the battle that neither Lee nor Meade had planned started to grow beyond first contact. Men fell in the fields and ridges west of town. Others were lost as Union defenders were driven back through Gettysburg toward Cemetery Hill. Streets that had carried ordinary town traffic became part of the movement of battle. The road hub that had drawn armies together now carried the consequences of their collision. On July 2nd, the losses widened across the Union flanks and center left. At Little Round Top, the fight for the high ground on the Union left became desperate because the position mattered to the survival of the line. Near Devil's Den, among the rocks and broken ground, the struggle became close and punishing. In the Wheatfield and around the peach orchard, attacks and counterattacks turned familiar farm landscapes into scenes of extraordinary violence. At Culp's Hill, on the Union right, the fighting showed that the battle was not confined to one flank or one dramatic point. The whole Federal position was being tested. Then, on July 3rd, the casualty scale took its most remembered form in the assault against Cemetery Ridge. Pickett's charge crossed roughly 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the Union center. The American Battlefield Trust describes that advance as leaving a trail of casualties across the fields before Cemetery Ridge. The phrase is simple, but the image is stark. Men moved forward in formation, under fire, toward a line that had held through 2 days of pressure. When the assault failed, the practical military outcome became clear. Lee had not broken the Union center, but the ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge had been filled with the price of the attempt. The dead and wounded were not abstractions to the town around them. Gettysburg was a community in Adams County, Pennsylvania, a place of roads, farms, homes, and civilian life. The battle had unfolded not on an empty stage, but across inhabited ground. When the firing stopped, the landscape still had to be lived with. Farms, fields, ridges, boulder-strewn slopes, and streets were left with the visible remains of combat. The armies had fought for position, but civilians and soldiers alike faced the aftermath, the wounded needing care, the dead needing burial, and the missing needing to be accounted for if they could be. This is where the meaning of the casualty number changes. Roughly 51,000 casualties is not only a statistic about battlefield severity. It describes a crisis of aftermath. Every category carried consequences. The killed had to be buried. The wounded had to be treated or transported. The captured entered another chain of uncertainty. The missing created silence in records and homes. A battle could end in military terms before its suffering ended in human terms. For the Union, the losses were bound to the preservation of the defensive position. The Army of the Potomac had held the high ground south of Gettysburg. It had endured attacks on both flanks and on flanks. It had repulsed the final assault on its center. That victory halted Lee's second invasion of the North and prevented the Confederate Army from exploiting a campaign on Union soil. But Meade's victory was not light. About 23,000 Union casualties meant that the army that had won was still damaged, still burdened, still surrounded by the evidence of what holding that ground had required. For the Confederacy, the losses were tied to the failure of a campaign. Lee had moved north, seeking to shift pressure away from Virginia and threaten Northern territory. His army had entered Pennsylvania and concentrated in the wider campaign around places such as Chambersburg, about 22 miles west of Gettysburg. But at Gettysburg, after 3 days of fighting, the Army of Northern Virginia had suffered about 28,000 casualties. Those losses came in an army of more than 71,000. The cost was not only immediate. It affected what Lee could do after the battle, how he could move, and what his army represented as it withdrew from Pennsylvania. Gettysburg's casualty scale also helps explain why the battle took on a national weight so quickly. Many Civil War battles were bloody. Many produced grief that reached into towns, farms, and cities across the United States and the Confederacy. But Gettysburg combined bloodshed with strategic consequence. It was fought on Northern soil. It involved the main Eastern armies. It ended Lee's second invasion of the North. It came at a moment when the war's direction mattered profoundly. Its dead and wounded lay across a landscape that would soon become not only a battlefield, but a place of burial, visitation, preservation, and interpretation. The number 51,000 cannot tell the whole story, but it tells where the story must turn. It tells why Gettysburg could not simply return to what it had been before July 1st. It tells why the fields between the low ridges would remain charged with memory. It tells why the aftermath demanded organization, recovery, and eventually commemoration. The battle had been decided in 3 days, but its cost extended outward in time. By the evening after the failed assaults, Lee's army still occupied ground west of the Union position, but the campaign had changed. The attempt to break Meade's line had failed. The Army of Northern Virginia had been badly hurt. The Army of the Potomac had held, though at a terrible price. The ridges, roads, farms, and town streets had become part of a larger national reckoning. What remained first was movement, the withdrawal of an army whose invasion had reached its limit. What remained after that was memory fixed to land. Gettysburg would not be left only as a name in reports. Its low ridges and fields would become a preserved landscape, a place where the cost of 3 days could still be traced across the ground where it happened. What remained first was movement. After the failed assaults of July 3rd, 1863, the battlefield did not suddenly become still. The smoke thinned. The firing diminished. But the armies were still there, facing one another across ground that had just consumed thousands of lives. On the Confederate side, the meaning of the day could not be avoided. General Robert E. Lee had tried to break the Union center on Cemetery Ridge after his attacks on the flanks had failed. The assault, remembered as Pickett's charge, had crossed the open ground from Seminary Ridge toward the Federal line and had been repulsed. The Army of Northern Virginia still existed as a fighting force, but at Gettysburg it had reached the limit of its campaign. Lee's second invasion of the North had begun with ambition. It had carried Confederate columns out of Virginia and into Pennsylvania. It had shifted pressure away from the war-torn ground of Virginia and brought the conflict directly onto Northern soil. The movement had threatened Union territory, drawn the Army of the Potomac after it, and created the conditions for a battle that neither Lee nor Major General George G.J. Meade had originally chosen. Now, after 3 days outside a small Pennsylvania town, that invasion was ending. The withdrawal from Gettysburg was not simply a change of position. It marked a strategic reversal. Lee had entered Pennsylvania with the hope that operations in the North might change the course of the war. Instead, the campaign ended with his army battered and moving away from the ridges where it had tried and failed to destroy Meade's line. The Union victory did not erase the suffering on the field. It did not restore the dead, or heal the wounded, or relieve the town from the burden of what had happened in its streets, fields, barns, orchards, and farm lanes. But it did mean that the Army of the Potomac had held. Cemetery Hill had held. Culp's Hill had held. Little Round Top had held. Cemetery Ridge had held. Across the 3 days, the defensive shape that formed after the first day's retreat through Gettysburg had survived everything Lee directed against it. That survival mattered. Beyond the map, Gettysburg stopped Lee's second invasion of the North. The Confederate Army would not continue deeper into Pennsylvania after the battle. The military initiative that had carried it northward had been broken on the low ridges around the town. And those ridges are important because Gettysburg was never only a point on a campaign map. It was a landscape. Its meaning came from ground that could be walked, measured, seen, and defended. Seminary Ridge, west of town, had been a Confederate line. Cemetery Ridge, south of town, had become the Union center. Cemetery Hill stood above the town as the position toward which Federal troops fell back on July 1st. Culp's Hill guarded the Union right. Little Round Top anchored the left. Between and around them were farms, roads, fences, boulder fields, wooded slopes, and open fields. The battle had moved through all of that. Its outcome depended on the relation between those places. High ground mattered. Road junctions mattered. The town mattered because 10 roads led into it, drawing separate columns toward a common point. The ridges mattered because they gave shape to defense and attack. The fields mattered because men had to cross them under fire. The stone walls mattered because they could become shelter, boundary, and target all at once. After Lee withdrew, the ground remained pond. At first, that ground was not a park. It was a wounded agricultural and civic landscape. Gettysburg was still a town in Adams County, Pennsylvania. Its farms still belonged to people. Its roads still carried local life. Its fields and ridges had been altered by combat, but they had not been created from memory. They had become historic because armies had collided there, and because the consequences of that collision were national. Over time, the battlefield became something else as well, a preserved place. Gettysburg National Military Park now protects a landscape of about 5,700 acres. That acreage matters not only because it is large, but because it holds together the relationships that made the battle understandable. A battlefield is not preserved by saving a single monument or one dramatic point. At Gettysburg, meaning lies in distance, elevation, approach, and line of sight. To stand between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge is to feel the space that shaped the third day. To see Cemetery Hill in relation to the town is to understand why the Union retreat on July 1st did not become complete disaster. To move from the ground near Devil's Den toward Little Round Top is to see why the Union left was so vulnerable and why its defense mattered. To trace Culp's Hill is to remember that the battle was not only fought in the famous open fields of Pickett's charge, but also in wooded, uneven ground on the Union right. The park preserves a battlefield between low ridges. That phrase can sound modest. Low ridges are not mountains. They do not dominate the horizon in a grand, theatrical way. But in battle, small differences in ground can decide where armies stand, where artillery can fire, where infantry can advance, and where a line can endure. Gettysburg's ridges were enough. They shaped decisions. They offered defensive strength. They made some attacks possible and others devastatingly costly. This is one reason the preserved landscape carries such force. Gettysburg is not remembered only through documents, casualty counts, or commanders' names. It is remembered through terrain. The ground itself helps explain the battle without needing to exaggerate it. The long, open approach to Cemetery Ridge tells its own story of exposure. The rise of Little Round Top explains its importance to the Union left. The position of Cemetery Hill shows why the Federal Army could reorganize after the first day. The relationship between roads and ridges explains why a battle that was not planned for Gettysburg became concentrated there. The National Park Service administers Gettysburg National Military Park today, and its work rests on a central idea that historic land can teach. The battlefield is not merely a backdrop for memory. It is evidence. It shows how civilian geography became military geography. A road became an avenue of advance. A farm field became a killing ground. A ridge became a line. A hill became an anchor. A town became a place of refuge, confusion, and suffering. Preservation also changes the way time is felt. The battle lasted from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. But the preserved battlefield allows those 3 days to remain visible across generations. It holds together the beginning west of town near McPherson Ridge, the retreat through Gettysburg, the desperate importance of Cemetery Hill, the second day's struggles at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, and the final assault across open ground on July 3rd. The park does not remove the horror from these places. It frames it. It asks visitors to understand that the beauty of the landscape today rests beside the violence of what occurred there. Quiet fields can be deceptive. A stone wall may seem simple until it is seen as part of a defensive line. A wooded slope may seem peaceful until it is understood as contested ground. The calm of preservation does not soften the history. It gives that history room to be studied. Gettysburg's preserved acreage also keeps the battle from becoming only an abstraction called Union victory or Confederate defeat. Those words are true, but they are incomplete. The outcome was produced by decisions made on specific ground, by soldiers moving through specific fields, by commanders judging ridges, roads, and flanks, and by armies enduring a level of loss that made the place impossible to forget. Lee's withdrawal closed the campaign, but it opened another history, the history of how Gettysburg would be marked, protected, interpreted, and mourned. The battlefield became a national landscape because the battle had become a national event. It had helped preserve the Union cause at a crucial moment. It had stopped a Confederate invasion on Northern soil. It had left roughly 51,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It had tied a Pennsylvania town forever to the question of whether the United States would endure. Yet preservation began not only with ridges and fields. It also began with burial. The dead had to be gathered from the landscape. The emergency of aftermath had to become an act of order and remembrance. On ground near the battlefield, a cemetery would be created for Union dead, shaped through the work of Gettysburg attorney David Wills and designed by landscape architect William Saunders. The preserved battlefield holds the military story in the land. The cemetery would give that story a solemn center. And there, a few months after the guns fell silent, Abraham Lincoln would come to Gettysburg and speak words that moved the meaning of the battle beyond the ridges, beyond the roads, and beyond the 3 days themselves. The preserved battlefield holds the military story in the land. The cemetery gave that story a solemn center. After the armies left Gettysburg, the town and its surrounding farms still carried the burden of what had happened there. The battle had ended, Lee's second invasion of the North had failed, and the Army of the Potomac had held its position. But the dead remained close to the surface of daily life. Emergency burials had been made in the urgency of July. Graves lay across fields, ridges, and farm ground where units had fought and fallen. What had been a military landscape now demanded a civic answer. That answer became the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Its creation was not inevitable. It required organization, land, design, and a decision about what Gettysburg would mean after the battle. Gettysburg attorney David Wills became central to that work. He was appointed as Pennsylvania's agent to arrange the purchase of land and the improvements needed for a cemetery for Union dead. In practical terms, this meant turning the chaos of aftermath into a planned place of burial. In symbolic terms, it meant that the Union dead would not remain scattered across the battlefield as isolated losses. They would be gathered into a national landscape of remembrance. The location mattered. The cemetery was established near the ground where the Union line had held after the first day, close to Cemetery Hill, the high ground that had helped shape the battle's final outcome. The name already seemed to carry a strange weight. Before the battle, it was connected to a local burial ground. After the battle, Cemetery Hill had become part of the military geography of survival. From there, the Union position had formed and endured. To place the cemetery in this area was to bind burial to defense, memory to terrain. The design was entrusted to William Saunders, a landscape architect. Saunders shaped the cemetery in a broad, semicircular plan, with graves arranged in a pattern radiating from a central point. It was a design of order after disorder. The battlefield had been confusion, smoke, sound, shifting lines, men moving through fields and streets, attacks rising and breaking along ridges and hills. The cemetery answered with geometry. Its semicircle did not erase the violence, but it gave the dead a visible structure, a sense that sacrifice could be honored in a common form. That design also changed how Gettysburg would be encountered. A battlefield can overwhelm by its scale. Gettysburg stretches across ridges, roads, farms, boulder fields, slopes, and town streets. The cemetery concentrated memory. It invited visitors to stand in one place and consider what had been paid across many places. The dead were no longer only part of unit reports or casualty summaries. They were present in rows, in a deliberate landscape built for mourning and national reflection. On November 19, 1863, the cemetery was dedicated. Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg for that ceremony. By then, more than 4 months had passed since the fighting. The nation was still at war. The battle's military result was known. The Confederate invasion had been stopped, and Gettysburg had become one of the defining Union victories. But its meaning was not settled. Battles do not interpret themselves. A field can show where men stood and where they fell, but it does not by itself explain why their deaths matter beyond grief. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address did that work in language of unusual brevity and force. He did not give a long military account of the 3 days. He did not walk through McPherson Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, or Pickett's Charge as tactical episodes. Instead, he placed Gettysburg inside a larger argument about the United States itself. The war, in his framing, was a test of whether a nation founded on the principle of human equality could endure. The dead at Gettysburg had given their lives in that test. The living, he said, had to be dedicated to the unfinished work. That shift mattered. Gettysburg had already halted Lee's second invasion of the North. It had already cost roughly 51,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It had already joined the military fate of the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to a small Pennsylvania town. Lincoln's address added another layer to it. It connected the battlefield to the survival of Republican government and to a broader wartime meaning of freedom. In that moment, The cemetery became more than a burial ground. It became a place where the war's purpose could be spoken aloud. The dead were not presented as having fallen only for territory, or revenge, or even victory in a single campaign. They were linked to the question of whether government by the people could survive civil war. That is why the address endured. It made Gettysburg a civic landmark as well as a military one. The words themselves have had their own afterlife. The Library of Congress holds 2 of the 5 known manuscript copies of the Gettysburg Address. That detail reminds us that the address is both an event and a text. It was spoken into the air at a dedication ceremony, but it also survived on paper, copied, preserved, studied, and returned to by generations trying to understand how a few sentences could carry the weight of a battlefield. Memory at Gettysburg did not stop with the cemetery or the address. In later years, the battle was also reimagined through visual spectacle. French artist Paul Philippoteau created the Gettysburg Cyclorama, an immersive depiction of Pickett's charge, the final great Confederate assault against the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. The choice of subject was revealing. Of all the battle's scenes, the cyclorama fixed attention on the climactic drama of the third day, the open ground, the advance, the Union line, the moment when Lee's last major effort at Gettysburg broke. The cyclorama became part of how later generations saw the battle. It did not replace the ground itself, and it did not carry the same civic function as the cemetery. But it showed that Gettysburg had entered the realm of national imagination. People wanted not only to read about it or walk the ridges. They wanted to see it, to be surrounded by it, to feel the scale of the moment through art. Memory became spatial again, this time inside a painted panorama. And so Gettysburg exists in layers. There is the actual town in Adams County, Pennsylvania, where roads drew armies together. There are the ridges: Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill. There are the fields and rocky slopes where the fighting moved over 3 days in July, 1863. There is the preserved battlefield, now protected within Gettysburg National Military Park, where the land still teaches the shape of the battle. There is the Soldiers' National Cemetery, organized through David Wills and designed by William Saunders, where burial became order and remembrance. There is Lincoln's address, delivered on November 19, 1863, giving the battle a meaning that reached beyond tactics and casualties. And there is the later art of memory, including Philippoteau's cyclorama, which turned Pickett's charge into an image vast enough to surround its viewers. None of these layers cancels the others. The military story remains essential. Gettysburg was fought by real armies under George G. Meade and Robert E. Lee. It unfolded because roads, decisions, uncertainty, and terrain brought men into collision. It was decided through combat at places whose names still carry the pressure of those days. But the reason Gettysburg endured in American memory is that the battle did not remain only a battlefield event. It became a place where death, preservation, democracy, and national purpose were bound together. The cemetery makes that transformation visible. It gathers the human cost into a designed landscape. Lincoln's words make it audible. They ask the living to understand the dead not as an ending, but as a charge. The cyclorama shows how memory continued to search for form, turning the battlefield into an enveloping vision of crisis and decision. Gettysburg did not save America in a simple or final way. The war continued. More battles followed. More graves would be dug. But at Gettysburg, Lee's invasion was stopped. The Union cause survived a severe test, and the meaning of that survival was spoken over new graves on Pennsylvania ground. The 3 days became more than a turning point in a campaign. They became a measure of what the nation had suffered and what it still claimed it might become. In the quiet of the cemetery, the noise of battle is gone. The ridges remain. The roads remain. The town remains. And the words remain, carrying forward the unresolved promise that Lincoln found there, that from the dead of Gettysburg, the living might draw a deeper dedication to the work still before them.